Hey guys, and welcome to the 6th in my NaNoWriMo videos. This time we're going to be talking about scene structure. There are a lot of different ways you can structure your scene. There's a lot of different ways you can structure your writing, but there are certain ways that people have been trained by their lifetime of reading to expect and accept. So you can deviate from these. Really anything that I'm telling you about, you can deviate, but do so only with the intent to create a certain sort of effect in your reader. Because again, we are primed to accept a certain sort of narrative structure subconsciously. So when you're going to do something else, by all means do it, but know what you're doing and know why you're doing it. With scene structure in particular, a scene is the basic unit of storytelling. In a lot of ways, it's what I think about the most while I'm writing. And I'm talking about this in very vague terms because scenes themselves are incredibly flexible. So I'm going to be giving you some advice as to how to structure them without being too specific in terms of what kind of story you might be telling. Because this works for basically any kind of conflict-driven narrative. And really what we're working on for NaNoWriMo is, generally speaking, going to be a conflict-driven narrative. Again, that's not the only kind of story you can tell, but it's the kind of story that people will most often be familiar with reading. So, in any given scene, there is a character who wants to accomplish something, or they want to stop someone from accomplishing something. So generally speaking, what you're going to be doing is focusing on the character with the highest stakes in the scene. And most of the time this will be your protagonist because it's their story you're telling. But not always, especially if you're writing a story with multiple viewpoints. You'll generally do well if you tell a scene from the perspective of the character with the most at stake, because their mental reality will be the most interesting in that particular scene. So what you want to do is, the first part of any scene is establishing context. Now, the reader might already be aware of what's going on from earlier scenes in the book, so you want to focus on what they don't know yet. If you're in a new place, you'll want to describe the place. If it's a new time, you want to describe what's going on at this time. If there are new characters, you want to bring them on stage and sort of give the reader a framework to understand what you're going to be telling them about. Creating this world in the mind of the reader is absolutely something you want to do. It's not necessarily going to be the very first thing you want to do, depending on how it is you want to expose the reader to this, but the order in which you do it should be intentional on your part. You should control how the reader experiences each scene in your book. I mean, that's a power you have as a writer, that you don't have a lot of control over what the reader brings to the table themselves, but you certainly have control over what you show them in what order, and you should take advantage of that to its fullest ability. So, beginning of the scene, you want to establish who's involved, the viewpoint character, who is opposing the viewpoint character, and what they want. You know, whatever means you use to get this across. I mean, that's you as a writer. That's your voice. So there's no hard and fast rules about how exactly you do this, but that's the first thing you're going to want to do in any given scene. The second part of any scene, the middle, and you may notice that this, in a certain way, mimics story structure in general, and it is that fractal. The second part of any scene is the conflict, the back and forth, where your protagonist is trying to get what they want, and the antagonist in the scene, not your story antagonist, but the scene antagonist, is whatever obstacle is in their way. It could be another character, it could be another condition, it could be society itself, whatever it is that is preventing your protagonist from simply walking in and getting what they want out of the scene. That's where your drama comes from. So the middle of the scene, the vast bulk of it, is going to be this conflict. And a lot of the times, that will be the biggest part, but it doesn't have to be. It depends on what you're trying to emphasize in that particular scene. And a given scene doesn't have to be very long. A lot of them will be a couple pages long, but it could be just a single paragraph long as it has the elements, or at least alludes to the existence of the elements. You don't have to show it all on the page, though you certainly can. The third part is the disaster, because your protagonist does not get exactly what they want in the scene. Otherwise, things are going too smoothly for your character, otherwise it's going to be a very short book. Most scenes you write will either end in immediate disaster, or the character will get what they want, but find out later on that it isn't what solves the problem that they're addressing in the book. So they will face some sort of, disaster is one word for it, catastrophe, whatever you want to call it. They don't get exactly what they want, but this leads them on to the next scene. If it's a fight, maybe they win the fight, but at some cost. Maybe they're wounded. Maybe they have to kill someone they didn't want to kill. Whatever it is, whatever type of story you're telling, the scenes, generally speaking, end poorly for your protagonist characters until you get to the end when they win over the odds. But this is part of the try-fail cycle, and it's called the try-fail cycle because they try and they fail again and again and again, and this exists on the scenic level. So eventually they will succeed after they've gone through whatever transformation, after whatever character arc, after whatever else happens in the book, to allow them to transform to succeed. But in this scene, in the individual scenes, they will generally speaking fail. And if you can make it fail because of their own flaws, tie that in with the rest of the themes of your book, that's the best. But they must just fail because they're not good enough yet. Maybe the antagonist is just too strong. And this leads them to the next scene where they try to another way around whatever problem it is they're dealing with or trying to avoid or whatever else is going on. So that's basic scenic structure. Introduction, conflict, and conclusion. Typically a conclusion which ends poorly for the protagonist. Before we transition on to the next scene where they try to fix things over, there's something called a sequel, or a transitionary phase, where we see into the protagonist's inner world where they reflect upon their failure or they react. It's basically the reaction to what has just happened. And you don't have to have one of these after every scene, but they do make good linking points, and it gives us an excuse to really delve into the psyche of our protagonist, which is the strength of prose. We can't really do this as well in movies, for example, except with clumsy, narration or whatever. The strength of prose is being able to see into the mental workings of your protagonist and see how they react to what's just gone wrong. But that's it. That's really how you write scenes. Consider these elements in a conscious way. And, while you're writing, once you get to that point where you're a skilled writer, it'll come to you naturally and you won't need to really think about it. It's just how you'll write. But this is the way that we, as humans, are primed to accept story. Introduction, conflict, conclusion. That's it for this week. Next week we'll be talking about show, don't tell, which is advice you've probably heard about, and I'll go into exactly how we can apply that during NaNoWriMo and what it means in a very practical sense. So thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time.